Hi, I'm Miles Hoffman.
And I'm Hilary Hahn, and we are backstage in
Houston.
And it smells
Jones Hall.
It smells like toilet air freshener.
Stop that.
Such as the air in a dressing room. It's not you. It's not personal. So we're in my dressing room, and I wanted to talk to Miles because you've been doing a really interesting thing with the program the last couple days. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, Houston Symphony started a new series this year. It's called the Access Series, and I'm the host of the concerts. I talk a little bit before the pieces. Talk about the pieces, talk about the composers, talk about whatever strikes me as interesting. Tonight, since you were playing a violin concerto, I talked about the violin, and I talked about the violin and the fiddle, and how a violin and the fiddle are the same thing, but not only the same thing, they come from the same word. Violin and fiddle are both from the same Latin root, vitula and vidula.
Oh.
Yeah, and vitula was the goddess of joyful celebration in Roman history, and if you take away the D, you get viola.
Viola, yeah.
Which was the Provençal word for a stringed instrument. Actually, the medieval Latin word for a stringed instrument was vidula, from joyful celebration. Oh. And if you take away the D, you get viola, viol, viola, and eventually violino. Mm-hmm. But in Germanic languages, the V is an F. So vidula becomes fidula, which becomes fiddle, which becomes fiddle. So violin and fiddle, not only are they the same instrument, they come from the same root, which is very interesting.
Wow, I learned something.
And I also informed the audience that there is a difference that I learned in Georgia some years ago between a violin and a fiddle. A violin has strings and a fiddle has strangs. That's the difference between a violin and a fiddle. Okay.
So actually speaking to an audience, mm-hmm. What do you think? This is something a lot of musicians think about, and it's actually a challenge because when you speak with an audience from the stage, it's hard sometimes to read the audience. We don't really grow up talking to the audience all the time as classical musicians. What do you find is a good set of basic tips for speaking from the stage?
I'm glad you asked. The first basic tip is not to use technical language. The first basic tip is not to assume that people know things that you take for granted as a musician.
That's true.
Basic terms that you've grown up with and known all your life, there's no reason that somebody who's not a musician would necessarily know that term, especially if it's in Italian or French or German. Seriously. If you don't speak Italian, why would you know what allegro molto vivace means?
Or a concerto.
Or a concerto. So that's the first thing. And I feel like I have a privileged background in this respect because neither of my parents was musicians. Mm-hmm. And when I got to college, I started studying the violin when I was a little boy, but when I got to college, I didn't know what a dominant was, I didn't know what a tonic was, I knew no music theory, I knew nothing.
Oh.
And so I come from a background of ignorance, of having learned all this stuff very late, and I don't assume that anybody knows the technical language. So I think the most important thing for a musician in talking to an audience is to not use technical language, not talk to an audience the way you talk to other musicians. It's very, very important. And to assume that the audience is intelligent and that they're interested, but to talk in plain English.
Makes sense. Anything else about content? History versus...
Well, the one thing that puts people to sleep right away is when you start talking about things like modulations from C-sharp minor to B major in a distant key, and the exposition of the recapitulation uses the retrograde inversion of the controverted, introverted reversion of the thing. And nobody cares about that. Most musicians don't care about that. And if you don't want to make people feel ignorant. And there's a big problem with
because they really aren't, because they know what they know from just listening.
That's right, and so they don't have a technical background in music. That doesn't mean that they're ignorant. I don't ever use the word, by the way, of course. I try to stay away from of course, because as soon as you say of course, that means that if you don't know that, you're an idiot.
Yeah.
So don't say of course, and I don't know, talk about things that
tell stories.
Well, and talk about things that you find interesting. You know, I think that's the most. If you find something interesting, then when you talk about it, somebody else is likely or liable anyway to find it interesting. That's the most important thing. And to speak naturally, the one thing I cannot abide is the people who, when they're speaking about classical music, all of a sudden their speech patterns change and they start enunciating, and all of a sudden they sound as if they have never, perspired, and there's nothing wrong with talking like a normal human being when you're talking about classical music. I mean, you're a normal human being, but you play very well.
I think I'm somewhat normal.
You seem pretty normal, even though you smell air freshener wherever you go.
You mentioned that you grew up in a non-musical family. So how would you...
It's funny, non-musicians, but not necessarily non-musical.
Okay.
A little bit of a difference.
So what was...
My father loved music. I think he sang in a glee club when he was in college. He listened to tons and tons of music. I grew up, my father took me to the record store, bought me my first classical recordings. I remember it was the Bach Double with Leonard Cohen and somebody, and I used to go to sleep every night from the time I was about 7 to a recording of Heifetz playing the Mendelssohn Concerto.
Oh.
And the Bruch Scottish Fantasy was also on that record. I still have it, and I never listened to the Bruch. I had no idea what it was. Yeah, I was always listening to Mendelssohn.
How did you then became a musician?
Well, I started playing the violin because I had a cousin who played the violin. And at the time, I stress at the time, I thought he was a cool guy, and so I asked for violin lessons.
We won't assume your cousin is watching.
No, I don't.
So you became a violinist. You said you played viola as well.
I switched to viola after I graduated from college.
Mm-hmm. How would you describe your career right now? Are you a musician, radio, everything?
Kind of everything. Every once in a while I realize I've been an NPR commentator non-stop essentially since 1989.
Wow.
So it's now 22, 23 years. So every once in a while, but I'm a musician, that's what I do. I've always thought of myself as a musician, but every once in a while I realize, I've actually had a career in radio.
Yeah.
And more people have heard me on the radio than have heard me play concerts just by the nature of things. The program I've been associated with now since 2002, Morning Edition, has a weekly listenership of 14 million people.
I know,
so,
it's amazing.
And I was on Performance Today every week for 13 years, and now I do a daily thing in South Carolina Public Radio too. A Minute with Miles.
Oh. Not a mile a minute.
Not a mile a minute.
I'm sure you've heard that a gazillion times.
A few times.
Yeah. Well, I guess...
So it's a mix, and I have a chamber music group, and we tour all over the country, and I play the occasional solo concert, and I teach. So it's a big mix.
I'm curious what the difference is for you performing on stage and speaking as a host.
It's a different kind of energy. It's a very different.
But it's also still
energy.
Performing in a way.
It is. And the funny thing is that I find that speaking on stage is a more of a nervous energy. There's more of a kind of a tension involved. And very often I speak before I play, and there's a real process that I've had to learn to speed up, of settling down.
I have that problem sometimes too.
Have you experienced that?
Yeah, it's very strange.
Because when you speak, you're kind of, it's a very different kind of energy from the energy that you need when you. I mean, imagine when you start the Prokofiev concerto and it has to start.
It's unsettling.
To have just been talking and maybe kidding around and blah blah blah, and then you have to all of a sudden be in a totally different mood and a totally different place, to use the cliche.
You're traveling in for these.
Yeah.
Is that something you do a lot? Do you travel for things like these Access concerts?
Well, this is the first season of the Access concerts. I travel to play concerts. I've been on the road for most of the month before this playing chamber music concerts, and then flying down here for these. And then I fly out to give the occasional lecture. It depends where.
Do you have a manager for that? How does that work?
Yeah, me.
Uh-huh.
Now I manage our chamber music group, the American Chamber Players. And we have a YouTube channel. And I have a YouTube viola channel, too.
We'll link everything up.
Sure.
Final question.
Yes.
You're
very good at this. Maybe you should do radio.
I grew up listening to radio, so it's kind of like, yeah. But as someone who works in radio, you see a lot of people, and granted you're primarily a musician, but you see a lot of people grow their radio careers, and I think the viewers would be curious to know what a radio career looks like. How do people start? Is it all at one station, you kind of build up your reputation there, you hop jobs and get better, and then you go somewhere else?
I don't know if there's a standard route. I mean, my entree into radio was a very funny thing. It started out because I wrote a funny radio show. It was a satire of... It was called Classics Illustrated, Great Music and Conversations with People Who Know More Than You Do. And it was with a friend of mine who had a wonderful radio voice, and Miles Hoffman, but every week there was a different reason that Miles Hoffman couldn't be there. And filling in for Miles, I did all these different characters and different voices. And that was on WETA in Washington back in 1981. And I got to know Martin Goldsmith, who was the program director at ETA back then, and he ran the tape recorder for our set of programs, these funny programs. And then 8 years later, he became the host of Performance Today.
Yes.
So Martin and I were friends at that point, and he had this idea for a feature that he wanted to call Jargon Busters. And he knew that I could...
That's like what you were talking about earlier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so he knew that I knew something about music, and he knew that I didn't talk in a stuffy way. And so he asked me if I'd be interested in doing that. And I said, well, as long as we can call it something other than Jargon Busters. And we called it Coming to Terms. We decided to give it a try. And that was the beginning of approximately 500 coming to terms, whatever you want to call them, episodes that I did for Performance Today over 13 years, and then moved over to Morning Edition. But that's a little unusual. I know people who have started as radio announcers out of college because they liked music and they got a job at the local radio station, and then something else opened up and then they kept doing that. I don't know that there's one route. It's also, when we hear radio, it's a wonderful medium and it's a very intimate medium, and so many of us depend on the radio and feel so strongly about the radio. But it's not, when you're actually doing it, it's not a terribly glamorous... In
studio, it's never glamorous.
No, the studio is a little room. You have headphones on, there's a glass wall, there's a producer there. The people who are editing and producing are sitting in little cubicles. There's nothing grandiose about radio, but it's a wonderful, wonderful medium.
It has so much impact.
It has tremendous impact, and I think that's because of the directness of the connection of just hearing the voice and hearing the ideas that people are saying. It's very direct. I think it's more direct than television.
It's less distracting. With television,
sure.
I think you can lose the message in all of the things. I think someone's trying to break in.
Somebody is knocking on the door. Should we open the door?
I think we should say goodbye and then open
We say
the door.
goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hilary. It's wonderful talking with you.